At Amica Insurance, we know it's more than a life policy. It's about the promise and the responsibility that comes with being a new parent. Being there day and night. And building a plan for tomorrow, today. For the ones you'll always look out for, trust Amica Life Insurance. Amica. Empathy is our best policy.
McDonald's presents Burger Reviews by Hamburglar, the classic cheeseburger. Hamburglar? Robble, robble. He said, the patties are juicier than ever before. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Robble. Available at most restaurants in this area.
When it comes to teaching kids and teens about money, practice makes perfect. That's where Greenlight comes in. With a debit card and money app of their own, kids learn to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest. Parents send instant money transfers, create custom chores, and automate allowance, while kids track their spending, set savings goals, and practice money skills they can use today and for life. Get 1 month free when you sign up at greenlight.com/podcast.
How's it going, and welcome to episode 27 of On the Wire, proud member of the Pitcher List Podcast Network. Follow the pod on the Twitter at OnTheWirePod. And if you're listening on a platform that allows ratings and reviews, please take a second to tell us what you think. I am Adam Howe, and you can follow me on the Twitter at 80grade. That's all spelled out. And this week, I am not joined by 2020 TGFBI champion Kevin Hastings, unfortunately. He's literally living it up on some remote island somewhere. That's all he would tell me. And that's fine. Have a good time, Kevin. But fortunately, rather, I am joined by one half of the Wins Above Fantasy podcast, Steve Gesuele. You can and should be following Steve on the Twitter at Stav8818. There'll be a link in the show description as well, directly to that. Steve, thanks for filling in for Kevin this week. You got some shoes to fill, but I'm pretty sure you're up for the task. I hope you're ready to talk some FAAB. How's the season going for you?
It's good, man. I'm definitely not going to be 2021 TGFBI overall champion. I'll be like TGFBI top half finisher, possibly.
Okay, we'll take it.
Yeah, that's what I could fill in for shoes. So I just won't try to mess up your FAAB this week, whereas you're normally hearing from a champion, but we'll try to survive until Kevin's back. But thanks for having me on. Really happy to do it and excited to get going.
Yeah, man, you guys do a great job over at Wins Above Fantasy, giving great advice and breaking down players in different situations. I know it's a weekly listening party for my ears and many others. How many leagues are you in this year?
Leagues with waiver wires or daily moves, I think I'm in like 5 or 6. And then I did probably like another 3 or 4 cut lines over on NFBC this year, which it's a little different for waiver there. There was only like 2 periods, but it's good too because you kind of need to space out your FAAB for those and you see how people react long term, and you kind of can apply some lessons there to the weekly FAAB, which I didn't really expect now that I've done a few of these over the last few years and done a weekly NFBC FAAB in NFBC with TGFBI. It's interesting, but I've been having fun. A few of my leagues are coming up to playoffs, and I'm on pretty much the borderline there and trying to squeak in over the last few weeks. Got some trade deadlines coming up. So it's a fun time. I know people are getting excited for football and things like that, but I really enjoy this time of year for fantasy baseball. Excited to break it down.
Yeah, I did my first cut line style in the Raz Bowl this year. And it was a lot of fun. I made the playoffs or the championship round, whatever that's called. I felt really good. I think I took a screenshot. I was in the top 10 at the time of the playoffs being broken out. So I felt really good about that. I haven't checked my standings since. So I'm just like, in my head, I like to think that I'm still top 10. That's probably the case or not. We'll see. I'll check after this, after we're done recording here. But the thing about those is like the cut lines and the best balls. It's really hard to like really pay attention to them if you have a bunch of other leagues, especially other FAAB leagues, or even a bunch of draft and holds where you're, setting your lineup at least twice a week if it's NFBC and you're doing FAAB every week. And I have 2 other daily move leagues as well, and it piles up. It piles up for sure. And you mentioned you have some playoffs coming up. It's something we don't talk about a whole lot on this pod, or honestly in a lot of pods I listen to at all, are the head-to-head leagues. And they're a whole different ball game. I have my home dynasty leagues, the head-to-head on Yahoo, and yeah, it's getting tight. We got 4 weeks left, and it's a lot of, I like head-to-head leagues a lot better when you're playing with people, and less so when you're playing with people you don't know, because okay, where's the rivalry? Like, where's the trash talk? And I'm not great at trash talk personally, but if it's with people I know, I can get down. I can get down with the best of them. But if I don't know anybody in the league, I'm like, I don't know what buttons to push. I don't know what's going to bother you. It's like, I'm not going to take the chance. I'm just going to focus on the leagues where I know the people, and I can talk a little bit more smack, and it makes a little bit more sense. All right. We are extremely excited not only to have Steve here, but alongside for the ride, we have some big shoes to fill, as we talked about with Kevin not being here. We have a very special guest to join us, Andy Patton, of course, the lead dynasty writer and manager at Pitcher List. He can and should be followed on the Twitter at Andy Patton PNW. In addition to all the useful prospect and dynasty content Andy puts out over at Pitcher List, he can also be heard regularly on multiple podcasts, including Never Sunny in Seattle, Score Zag Score, and you would definitely know that based on looking at Andy right now, as he is all decked out and Zag stuff. Good on you in that. And then, of course, on our own On the Farm in the Pitcher List podcast network, you can look for links to all of Andy's work in this episode description, and do yourself a favor and make sure to check it all out. Andy, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to picking your brain a bit later on the impact of some possible late call-ups. We saw Joe Adele come up or recalled up recently. But for now, just how you doing, man?
I'm good. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate both you guys taking the time, and it was a good timing because I write the weekly stash articles at Pitcher List, the pitcher stash list at Pitcher List. That's very hard to say. That comes out on Saturday mornings, and then the hitter stash list comes out on Sundays, and it's 10 prospects worth stashing specifically in redraft leagues. So it is prospect content, although it is not dynasty content in that sense, but it's fun to especially at this time of the year, like where you're really getting down to it. At the beginning of the year, you're talking about all the top names. You're talking about Wander Franco, you're talking about Jared Kelenic, all those guys. Now, yeah, we're talking about some big names still. We'll talk about Bobby Witt a little bit later, but we're also talking about some lesser guys who maybe aren't in the top 100 or maybe not even in the top 150, but guys who there's a path to playing time that you could see that could show itself in September. And they're hitting really well in AAA, and maybe that's all you need is a few good weeks of solid production from some of these lesser known prospects. And it's a really fun time to be doing that research and trying to find some of those sneaky guys who maybe aren't being talked about in like the national scope.
Sure. Yeah. And you said we're going to talk about Bobby Witt a little bit later. That is not a name that has ever been uttered on this podcast ever before. No, first of course. Yes. First time for everything. Obviously, longtime listeners know that Bobby Witt comes up at least every other episode, especially with Kevin at the helm as well. And he's obviously gotten me on the bandwagon as if I needed any help as well. So I'm looking forward to talking about that a little bit later. But for now, we're going to get right into our news and notes section. We'll start it right off. Steve, I'm going to start with you. Of course, as a reminder, we tend to talk about news and notes on this podcast that revolve around things that may change your determination on who to bid on in FAAB. And so other major changes that may not affect that probably go to the wayside. So if we miss something, sorry, there's a whole bunch of other podcasts on the podcast network that you should be listening to for that information. So Steve, we'll start off with you. Ramon Laureano has been suspended for 80 games after testing positive for a performance-enhancing substance. So he'll be out well into 2022. But for the remainder of 2021, who do you think gets a boost in playing time, or perhaps a boost just in the lineup itself in Oakland?
So a guy that I'm interested in light of this news is Josh Harrison. I know he's been hitting pretty well, and he was probably rostered in some deeper leagues when he was with the Nationals, but I think maybe people probably thought that he would be more of a utility guy and see a few more days off. Then he went to Oakland. I know they like to mix and match and everything like that, but he could get some more looks in the outfield. He's played all three outfield positions this year. I think he's played like 21 games in the outfield this year. So it's something that he's comfortable with, and it's nothing that's like going to pop off the page. It's going to be like a mid 700s OPS, maybe a little bit closer to 800 when he's on a hot streak or something like that. But he walks, he steals bases, and he's got some pops. If he's out there, he's definitely like a guy to plug in if you're dealing with some injuries, that has position flexibility, because I think he's eligible in second, third, and the outfield, considering how many games he's played there. So he could be useful in like the 12 to 14 team range, just because he's going to probably get some more time in the outfield to pick up for Laureano's suspension. And then another guy, and I think this is probably a good one to bounce off Andy, but it's a guy that's one of those peripheral prospects. These call-ups more just because it's like it's not the top 100 names. It's just guys that have been randomly raking in the minors. And one of those guys is Cody Thomas. He has 18 home runs in 59 AAA games for Las Vegas, Oakland's AAA affiliate. And I know Vegas is a very hitter-friendly environment, and he's still playing in hitter-friendly parks, but it's still good for a 139 WRC plus. So despite the context, he's still close to 40% better than league average. He does strike out a ton. He's like at a 32% clip this year. So that's definitely something that's concerning in his profile. And he's not yet on the 40-man roster for Oakland. So they'd have to make a move. But when September rosters come up, that could be a guy that could step in and has some legit power. So he could go on like an Aristides Aquino type run or something like that for September. So that's a guy that I'd be interested for the call-up wise, but for a guy that's actually in play right away, that's Josh Harrison with the Laureano suspension.
Yeah, I'll tack on real quick on Thomas. I liked when I saw his name come up here because Oakland, they got rid of Greg Deichmann at the trade deadline. I think they sent him to the Cubs. And so that was their fourth-ish outfielder type guy that was sitting in AAA. And now it's Thomas, and Thomas he's going to be Rule 5 eligible. So adding him to the 40-man, if they want to keep him, is something they're going to have to do as it is. Like you said, 18 home runs. He had 23 home runs in 2019. He had 19 home runs in 2018. He had 20 home runs in 2017. All of that was with the Dodgers. So the 18 home runs this year, obviously it's in less games, but it's not like it's only a product of playing in Las Vegas, which clearly helps. I think it's important to always have that context when looking at AAA stats in the PCL, but this is a dude with a lot of thump. He's got a lot of power, and he's going to strike out a ton, and he's probably more of a fourth outfielder type guy long term. But if you're just looking for a guy who might catch a hot streak or get some playing time in the short term, yeah, I'd be all over him if he gets called up in some of those deeper leagues.
Yeah, Josh Harrison played both second and third base today. He did play in the outfield on Friday with Tony Kemp in left field earlier today. And of course, we record this on Saturday evenings. So when I say today and you're listening to this on Sunday, please don't be too confused. All right, Andy, we'll move over to Houston. And then the Astros first baseman, Yuli Gurriel, was placed on the 10-day IL, retroactive to August 3rd. He has some neck stiffness, so he'll be out for at the very least through the first half of this coming week, if not a little bit longer. We often say in this podcast that when you have a chance to get a piece of the Houston lineup in your fantasy roster, you should do so. Tell me, who may we be seeing getting extra playing time in Houston with Gurriel out, even if it's just for a short period of time?
Yeah, you'd wonder if they are regretting a little bit letting go of Abraham Toro for a variety of reasons, but this probably hurts seeing how successful he's been and knowing that they could plug him in here. But they have Aledmys Diaz. I think he's going to play a fair amount. I got a note on him a little bit later, but the guy I wanted to talk about here, and it's not just because he's one of 3 Gonzaga players in the MLB, although it is a weird coincidence that he happens to come up in this circumstance. But that would be Taylor Jones, 6'7" first baseman for Houston. He played a little bit for him last year during the pandemic. He's played a little bit more for him this year. He's played about 30 MLB games. His numbers in the big leagues are bad. There's no other way to put it. He's got a 181 batting average. So I know there's some thought that he's maybe a quad A guy because he's hit a blistering 325 in AAA this year. And he hit 291 in AAA last year, 27 combined home runs in those 2 seasons. And that's only about 155 games. So a 30 home run-ish pace in AAA. So a guy who's got a ton of thump. His play discipline numbers are not great. They're good in AAA, but they have not been good at the major league level so far. So that's kind of something to watch here. But again, we're talking short term. We're talking a guy who's going to play probably the majority of games, at least while Gurriel is out, which may only be about a week or so, if not even that long necessarily. But if he's going to play the majority of the time, I think they're playing Colorado. I think they're playing Colorado in Houston, which is not as big of a benefit, but Colorado's pitching hasn't really been good home or away. So there's a chance that he could get into a few balls the next couple days. So somebody to maybe throw a little bit of FAAB on if you need to.
Yeah, to your point, they do play Colorado, but they do play it in Houston. So it's something to keep an eye out there as well. All right, Steve, we'll move over to Boston for you. Manager Alex Cora, in my mind, finally removed Martin Perez from the rotation. He did announce that Tanner Hoek would be most likely to be his replacement. Do you see Hoek sticking around in the Boston rotation the rest of the season, or is he just keeping the seat warm for the impending return of Chris Sale, or is there possibly room for both?
I think there's room for both. I really do see Hoek sticking around. I think the Red Sox are in a rough patch now. The Yankees are breathing down their neck a bit after the momentum from the deadline. They've just been a lot better. And the Red Sox pitching, that's why I thought they would be bad this year, but it's been obviously a lot better, and they've been very good. But it hasn't been as good as it's been in the beginning of the season. So I think a guy that they'll move out is Garrett Richards. He's been pretty bad since the calendar turned to June. I know he had a really good May, but he has a 6.66 ERA, a 6.66 K per nine, not good, ominous signs there since July 1st, and then a 3.68 walks per nine. So he has not been good in any facet. I think that he's going to be the guy that gets the boot to the bullpen once Sale comes back. And I've always been a sucker for Richard's stuff, like to a fault. I always like to throw a late draft pick on him in redraft leagues seemingly every year just because he's got stuff, can strike out guys. But I think that could play up in the pen, even as a short relief guy or even like a one-inning guy. I think he would be really good for them there. If I were the Red Sox, that's what I would do. And I'm hoping that's what they would do, just to see Hook stick around in the rotation. But they've done some surprising things with sending him back down. But as it gets to crunch time, I think this is what they're saving him for, and can burn the innings now when it matters the most. I think Huck will stick in the rotation.
All right. As a Boston fan myself, I'll be very interested to see how this all plays out. Of course, with the innings limitations that we're going to see coming up across the league, between the limits that teams will impose on their pitchers based on the limited amount of innings that they pitched last year. You know, we saw teams like Milwaukee come out and say at the beginning of the season that more than likely their starters are going to see about 100 innings increase from last year. That's not going to be an exact science and all, but it was a nice little barometer to use when looking at these expectations for how many innings to see, and especially for the younger guys like Howick and what have you. It's interesting to see how each team decides to manage instead of using the word manipulate, but manage their inning restraints, whether it's you pitch 4 innings in one game instead of 5 or 6 and would stretch that out throughout the year, or what you're cut off at the end of August and you're either going in the bullpen, or you know what, you're just demoted and rest up. Maybe we'll send you to the Arizona Fall League for a couple more innings at the end, but it'll be interesting to see how, especially Boston, who's obviously in the heat of a pennant race in the AL East, manages that. All right, from Boston to Chicago, Andy, the Cubs placed Jason Hayward on the 10-day IL with finger inflammation and recalled the aforementioned Greg Deichmann to take his place on the roster, with the Cubs lineup decimated after their recent trade deadline. Should we be paying attention to Deichmann, and please correct me on that name, this weekend before our bids go final on Sunday?
Yeah, I think it's Deichmann, but I'm guessing. But so I'm not a huge Deichmann guy. I think there was a power. I don't even really want to call it a surge. There was a little glimpse of some power in 2019 at AA with Oakland, which again, AA for the A's, a little bit more pitcher friendly. So he had 11 home runs in 80 games. So it was like, okay, maybe we're going to see some more of that power, but we haven't seen it since then. We never really saw it before then. So he doesn't impact the ball hard enough for me to be super interested in him. His walk rates are tremendous. He's walking 19% of the time in AAA. That's a 60-game sample, which isn't huge, but also is big enough that 19% of the time is ridiculous, even through 60 games. That's pretty insane. He hit 300, 128 WRC plus. Was really, and we're talking 128 WRC plus in AAA with no power. That is difficult to do. So he was an impactful hitter at that level, but I don't see a huge fantasy profile here. The average is probably going to be okay. The OBP will be good. So in leagues that count on base percentage, that probably gives him a little bit more of a boost. He's just not, he strikes me as more of a quad A type guy, or maybe more of a fourth outfielder is a better way to put it. I don't generally like the term quad A, but sometimes it's applicable. For me, I think for the Cubs, if they're going to actually do anything remotely interesting, I would want to see Brennan Davis. I don't think that we're going to see Brennan Davis. He's striking out like 30% of the time in AA, and he's very young. I think he just turned 22, or he's still, he just turned 22. So he's very young. He strikes out a ton, but he's a really fun prospect. And the human part of me would like to see the Cubs try to help make their fans feel better about trading their entire World Series team by calling up one of their fun young players and not Diekman. No offense to him. I don't think that they will, and I can understand the business money reasons why. I don't agree with them, but I can understand them. But if Diekman's the guy, and he's up with the team right now, I believe, if he's the guy, I'm not super intrigued in deeper OBP leagues. Sure, I think you can give him a look. He does have some speed. He might swipe some bags, but he doesn't hit the ball hard enough for me to be super interested in him as a fantasy guy.
I saw I don't know if it was real or not, but I saw what I thought was a credible tweet, because it had the little, blue or white check mark on it, that said that Brendan Davis was in Chicago at Wrigley, and then I saw nothing else about that.
So he was there. It's actually what happened is he was there, but he was doing a photo shoot because he just won like prospect of the month or something. Sure. And it was like, I'm sure they didn't intend for it, but the optics were bad.
Yeah.
It didn't look good.
Don't go jumping out and picking up Brendan Davis this weekend unless you see something new that shows that he's actually going to stick around in Chicago. All right. So, Steve, we'll go out to the West Coast for you. And this one with Dave Roberts saying that he doesn't expect to have Clayton Kershaw back in the Dodgers rotation until, quote, sometime in September. September is a long period of time. It could be first, it could be the 30th. Who knows? Of course, with Trevor Bauer's leave of absence being extended again through mid-August 13th, who's to say it won't be extended again after that? I'm sure the Dodgers did add Max Scherzer, but on the other two pitching acquisitions, who should we be more interested in? And these are both very interesting names that I want to make sure that we get as much detail as possible. Danny Duffy or Cole Hamels, who they just signed.
I would say neither, honestly. But if I had to choose, I would choose Duffy. He's been good when healthy, showing some strikeout upside. I think he was having his April was like flashes of 2016 when he was a legit like fantasy 1 or 2, pretty much. I know that didn't hold up, and we weren't expecting it to, just because Danny Duffy gets injured, and that's exactly what he did. But as far as Hamels, I just shy away from pitchers that don't have a normal off season or like the full spring training. Like Jake Odorizzi this year comes to mind. He just hasn't really looked right. Kimbrel, I think it was 2 years back when he signed in like June or July. Pitchers are weird, man. I think they need like routine and stuff to get in their groove. So I am not interested in like a 36 or 37-year-old Cole Hamels coming back for the Dodgers in September. Although if there is any team that could pull that off, it probably would be the Dodgers. So they'll probably make me look bad now. As far as other pitchers, though, like I'm just hoping they can get Tony Gonsolin. He's clearly been battling like that shoulder fatigue all season, and it's been bothering him. They've put him on the IL, I think, twice now since he's come back, and just really hasn't looked right at times on the mound. I know his control wasn't really great to begin with, and it's been even worse this year. He's been walking a lot of guys. So ideally they can buy time and get him right and healthy, but I'm not counting on that happening either. But if I had to choose one, it would be Duffy for now, but I don't think he's going to be back until September either. It could be an interesting time. I'm not sure who would even be first out of all those guys to come back, Duffy, Hamels, or Gonsolin, but something to keep an eye on. Like, it's cheap wins for the Dodgers. Even if they throw these guys behind openers, like even better. You only need 2 or 3 solid innings to get a win.
Yeah, I'll be very interested from a baseball perspective to see how the Dodgers handle Hamels in September. He signed for I think $1 million with a $200,000 bonus for every start he makes. So I think that I see that as they're signing him as an emergency pitcher where they call up when they need to give some guys some extra rest. If they want to really instill Dodgeritis on the entire rotation, they could easily just do that with Hamels filling in as much of the gap as possible to allow their guys to get right by that time the playoffs roll around. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But Andy, we'll go to Cleveland now, and the future Guardians recalled Andrés Giménez on Saturday. From what I understand, they probably would have recalled him a little bit earlier, but there were some visa issues because they were playing in Toronto. But now he's back. And what role should we be expecting him to play in Cleveland moving forward for the rest of the season? And you know what? Because you're the dynasty guy and beyond.
All right. Yeah, I think Giménez is going to be the starting second baseman. They had Owen Miller in that stopgap role. Owen Miller is another guy that maybe fits that potential quad A thing, although hopefully not. I think he could be very good, but he has been very bad at the major league level so far this season. 24 games, he's hitting 132. So I don't think he was ever the intended. When they traded Cesar Hernandez, I don't think they were keeping the position warm for Owen Miller. I think they were keeping the position warm for Andrés Giménez. And now that he's here, I think that's what he's going to do. I think their vision of having Giménez and Rosario up the middle is what they're going to try to do for the second half of the season. Rosario obviously is a guy who has really come into his own and looks like a pretty good player. The hope is that could be the same case with Giménez as well. He's a guy who hasn't hit at the big league level just yet, at least not this season. He actually was not too bad with the Mets in 2020. He doesn't draw a lot of walks, hasn't shown a lot of power, at least over the fence power. But what we've seen this year, the strikeout rate is way up to around 30%. Again, it's a small sample size. He looked pretty rough when he first came up with Cleveland. I think we're going to see an improved version of Giménez for the second half of the season, so much so that I think he's probably worth adding in some of those deeper redraft leagues. I'm not going to be racing to pick him up in 10 or even 12 teamers unless you're very desperate for speed. But I think he's going to have a regular role for this point forward. Cleveland is not playing for anything this season. I think that one of their biggest goals for the year, frankly, was to have that middle infield of Rosario and Giménez and see what it looked like. And that was why they had Hernandez on the roster as a stopgap to eventually trade him. They made that move happen. And so now they're going to lay their cards out and see what they got in these two guys. Giménez is a speed play. He's not much of a batting average guy, even at his peak. I don't think he's going to hit more than 270, 280 maybe, which would be valuable, but I'm not going to pretend I think he's going to hit that for the rest of this year necessarily, but he's going to swipe some bags. He can get into a ball every once in a while. So he's a guy that he's better in batting average leagues than OBP leagues because he doesn't draw a lot of walks, but a guy that I'm interested to see how he does the rest of this year. I don't think that he's going to be the full version of himself yet. He's only 22 years old. I think long-term he could be a very capable middle infield bat. I don't think he's ever going to reach the potential of must own your starting second baseman or your starting shortstop in fantasy necessarily, but I could see him being a really useful second base shortstop guy or utility infield guy for fantasy leagues. And I think that there's a chance we'll see some pretty good glimpses of that this year as well.
Yeah, unfortunately, Cleveland's facing off against Tyler Alexander today, the lefty. So Giménez did not make it into the lineup upon his arrival into Cleveland, but that's not to say that he'll be in a full-time platoon, but it's something to keep an eye out. Of course, with Ernie Clement getting the start at second base this evening. And we're still only a couple of innings into that game. No pinch hits, no pinch runs yet, but I would be surprised to see him pinch him running at the very least by the end of the game. All right, Steve, we will end it with you in New York. Aroldis Chapman was sent to the IL with left elbow inflammation, something you never want to hear. Just tell me, though, we'll get to closers a little bit later. I want to focus on this one specifically. Is there an obvious play this weekend to garner extra saves out of the Yankees bullpen?
I don't think there's an obvious play, but I'm betting on Jonathan Lysiga. He got the save today. I actually picked him up in a 14-teamer before that happened today. That was this morning as soon as the Chapman news came out. So I have I have the receipts to prove it. Just tweet me. I'll send you the screenshot if you need the proof. But he looked really good doing it today. He needed only 8 pitches. He got 2 weak ground outs and a fly out. He was touching 100. He's been great in the relief role all year. It does come with the caveat that Zach Britton and Green did pitch the last 2 days unavailable, most likely. And Lysiga actually pitched back-to-back yesterday and today. So on Sunday, he'll be unavailable. So one of those guys might grab a save on Sunday if that does come up. But despite that, I would still bet on Lysiga. I think Britton could be a guy that could get some saves if 2 lefties are coming up in the 9th. But they mentioned on the Yes broadcast today that he's talked about liking the closer role and thriving in that. And it only takes 1 or 2 saves to get in that role. And, okay, this is our guy. The Yankees obviously have had Chapman, so they're used to a guy locking down the role. I know things can change with him being out, but they've had a guy that they've given the job to. So that could be the case here if Lois Segura runs with it. And I think he could. And even not, he should get a decent amount of saves and still provide you with good strikeouts and ratios. I think it's a pretty much an add sort of everywhere thing, especially if you need saves at all, which most teams at this point do, just because of the madness that went down at the deadline with closers and how it always is with that. Yeah, that's the guy that I'm betting on.
Yeah, if you're not at the top of saves in your league or the very bottom of saves in your league, there's a lot of room to maneuver as far as gaining points in that category. Unfortunately for me, that's pretty much where I live. It's either at the very top for saves or the very bottom. So there's not many moves I'm doing in in bullpens, which is fine. Like, it's stress-free bidding for me when it comes to worrying about the closers. Let everybody else worry about them. I'll just talk about them. But luckily, in the about 6 or 7 FAAB leagues that I'm in this year, it's not an area that I have to focus on too much. Of course, you got to keep an eye on Chad Green. As you mentioned, he was the one getting those save opportunities when Chapman was struggling before the All-Star break. He's had his ups and downs as well, and he's really thrived in the multi-inning role, I believe. But
yeah, he hasn't been as great since the All-Star break, too.
Yeah,
I know, his overall numbers look really good because he was amazing prior to the All-Star break, but he's hit a rough patch here, so I think that opens the door a little bit more for Johnny Lasagna.
There you go. All right, that's going to wrap us up the news section of the pod. As always, we try to keep the focus to news that might affect your FAAB considerations this Sunday. We may have left out some other important items worth knowing. You should be staying up to date with all of those news and notes by listening to the daily First Pitch podcast hosted by Nick Pollock during the week, and of course, Alex Fast with Fast Pitch on the weekends. It's 15 minutes full of the most important things that happen in baseball the day before, and is a must listen every day to stay up to date with what's going on across the league, including bullpen adjustments, big time hitter performances, and of course, starting pitching spotlights. Speaking of spotlights, we're going to go into our focus topic of the episode. And Andy, we brought you on for multiple reasons. Of course, I was really hoping you'd be decked out in all the Zag stuff as well, so that worked out nicely.
Of course.
Our focus topic is Gonzaga basketball, right?
Yeah.
Oh man, I'm ready to go.
We'll time it exactly 1 minute and 30 seconds, so you can just hit that button 3 times if you want to.
There you go.
Now, and we want to talk to you about what you do best and what you focus on, and that's dynasty and prospects over at Pitcherlist. And I want to pick your brain about the impact those late call-ups. So we had Shelly Verstraete on at the beginning of the season, and she was great about talking about some of those players that might get the call-up early on, right after we pass the time manipulation deadline, as I like to call it, like 3 weeks into the season. When she nailed a bunch of players, it was amazing. I kept seeing these names pop up 3 days after the pod. It was just like, boom, Shelly's nailing it. So what I'm going to ask you talk about is like these late season call-ups. We mentioned Joe Adell just got called up or recalled up again, and this is late into the season after he's supposedly made his adjustments, and hopefully he's ready to go. But we're going to see some guys making their MLB debut either in August on playoff teams that want to make sure that these guys are on the playoff rosters, because they've got to be up in the major leagues before the end of August to be eligible for that. And then, of course, we're going to get the cup of coffee guys in September that are looking to make a name for themselves. The teams want to get good looks. And, of course, the rosters are not going to expand the way they had in the past. So feel free to touch on that as well. But what kind of impact can these players make? Like, realistically, we have less than 2 months to go in the fantasy season in most leagues, and especially in head-to-head leagues where you're fighting for playoff spots for the next 3 to 5 weeks. But in roto leagues, obviously, the impact that they can make in September is going to be equal regardless. So talk to me about some of these guys we should be expecting to come up, and then really what kind of strategy should be used when either stashing or bidding a lot of money at this stage of the game, whatever FAAB you might have left at this stage in the game, and what kind of impact these players could possibly make.
Thanks for putting the pressure on me to be as accurate as Shelly, because that's going to be damn near impossible. So yeah, I think this is a fun part of the season, just because there is the opportunity for some of these prospects to really pop. And I think we're used to seeing the really top tier prospects make their debut in that kind of funky April period when the deadline has passed, and then they pretend that they wanted to wait a few days after that for whatever reason. And that's when we were expecting to see Franco, and it was a little later than that, and Kelnick was a little later than that, but we saw them in the first half of the season, albeit barely, but we did. And so now usually there's not as many top tier prospects who are around still at this time. The most notable one we talked about earlier is Bobby Witt, a guy who seems quite likely to make his major league debut in September. The Royals are generally aggressive with promoting prospects. Obviously, there's a couple guys who've been up and down. Vidal Brujan is a prominent example of that, who I think will be back. I don't know if the Rays are going to figure out what they want to do with him, but I think that he'll be back. And then guys like Keibert Ruiz, who's on a new team, that obviously is something that changes the equation considerably for him, frankly, for him and Josiah Gray, who Josiah Gray, if he's not owned in any of your leagues, should be immediately. He's very good. He's got a chance to pitch every fifth day. I don't need to go into a whole lot more detail.
He's very good.
He's really good. Frankly, Ruiz is really good too, although there's a little bit more nuance with him in terms of when he comes up and if he's going to be catching every day for Washington or every day as compared to other catchers. But I think in terms of strategy, what's interesting about this time of year, as I mentioned the big names, and there are some big names that we'll probably see, but this is a time of year where a lot of guys pop who you're not expecting. I know the example that comes to my mind is Kyle Lewis, and I know that Kyle Lewis was a prominent prospect in his own right, but he had fallen down a lot of prospect lists. He'd had significant knee injuries in the minor leagues with the Mariners. And then when he came up with a lot less fanfare than you would have expected from a guy who was drafted as high as he was. And then he lit the league on fire. He had like 6 home runs in a week and was the talk of the town. And so those are the kind of things that were hard to expect. Even prospect people. I'm sure he was mentioned by people who write articles like I do, or Scott White at CBS, who write 5 guys who might get called up this week. Like, he probably got mentions, but I don't think that anybody was like, yeah, this guy's going to hit a bunch of home runs this week. Or Aristides Aquino and the run that he went on a few years ago. Or Randy Arozarena, who was not a top 100 prospect. He had previously been a top 100 prospect, so it wasn't like insane that he was good, but it was not expected for him to do what he did. And so that's what's fun, I think, about this time of year, is there are guys that I spent most of my day today working on these articles and trying to figure out like who to put on this list. And there are guys that I didn't even think about who realistically might have a really good week 2 weeks from now. It's just and it's fun. Like, it's frustrating in some ways because you don't know who those guys are going to be. If I did know who those guys are going to be, I probably would have a slightly more lucrative position covering prospects than I do. But that's what's fun. And so for me, like, there are a couple names that I have that I'm saving for a little bit later in the episode who are like not top 100 guys who I think could conceivably be that guy. And if I get even one of them, I'm going to let Shelly know, because that would be super cool. But then there's also some of those, like I said, the top tier guys who we're expecting, the Bobby Witts. And then this part of the year is also the frustrating will they or won't they. And Witt, I'm leaning, yes, they probably will. But 2 guys that I took off my list this week were Jeter Downs and Adley Rutschman, because I don't think that those guys are going to get a look this year. Downs because he's really struggled in the minor leagues and never really turned it around. Rutschman because the O's haven't even promoted him to AAA yet. And it's not because of performance. He's hitting the crap out of the ball. They just haven't given him that bump yet. So I don't see why they would elevate him all the way to the major leagues. It's similar for them and Grayson Rodriguez, their top pitching prospect. And both of those probably have some financial implications as well, which is always a thing that unfortunately fantasy managers have to be thinking about. But it's a fun part of the year because it's a bit unknown. It's really tricky to navigate. There's not a lot of clear-cut answers at the beginning of the year. I keep going back to Shelly. I'm not trying to trash on her, but it's a little bit easier to predict which prospects are going to probably come up in April than it is to predict which prospects are going to come up right now.
That was definitely some smack talk. That's what I heard.
She can respond if she wants. But yeah, I think it's a really fun kind of guessing game to try to play right now. And for me, in my leagues where I have auction bidding or FAAB, I'm going to be looking really closely at some of these guys and some. I also have Bobby Witt. I know Steve mentioned that earlier in the show. I'm waiting on him in a league. I've been waiting on Joe Adell in TGFBI the entire season. And then of course he came up on a Monday after I set my lineup. So I was like, that is super annoying that I had already set my lineup. But yeah, I know, of course. But no, it's a fun time of the year to be trying to figure out what to do with these prospects.
I'll let you get to the names later on in the podcast. But as a general rule, Do you find that the players that are coming up later in the season are on decimated teams like the Cubs or like the Rangers, who have traded away a bunch of players and now they have openings? Or are you focusing more on the teams that need the help running into the playoffs, like adding a Jarren Duran to the Boston, outfield? Which one do you think, which one people should be looking at if they're not reading your article specifically? Which one should they be doing it on their own?
So that's a fantastic question that I wish I had a more clear answer to, because I can't think of a specific pattern where you can expect a player to pop more. Certainly, if a player is coming up to have a full-time role in an offense that's good, we'll stick with hitters, that is likely a better situation. Obviously, Duran is in that situation where he's not only is he up and playing pretty much every day, he's in an offense that should allow him to accrue more counting stats, which is helpful. You look at, speaking of Boston outfielders, like one of the most prominent examples of this is the Jacoby Ellsbury when he got called up many years ago, and he lit the league on fire in a way too. And it was because he was on a really good team. And so he got an opportunity to do more stuff. But that is a more rare situation. Rarely do teams call up prospects who they haven't called up before, who all of a sudden step into starting roles on good teams. It's rare. It happened with the Arozarena, so it's not unprecedented, but it is rare. It's mostly the Kyle Lewis and the Aquino situations where they're on teams that are not contending and they're just getting an opportunity to play, either because they're replacing somebody who's hurt or replacing somebody who just wasn't very good, or like you mentioned, replacing somebody who got traded at the trade deadline because they're trying to rebuild and they're bringing up somebody younger to fill in that spot. So it's tricky. I'm going to lean towards guys who I think are going to get more playing time because I think that's just the easiest way to do it. But it would be nice if you knew they were in an offense where they're potentially going to get more counting stats.
Sure. Steve, when you hear all this, I want to get your take on when you're playing in your leagues, whether it's this coming year or the rest of this year, or it's previous years, what has been your strategy when it comes to either stashing these types of players or going after them aggressively in FAAB, whether it's early on to stash them or they just got called up? What kind of expectations do you typically have? Is what kind of impact they can make to your teams? And does it matter what the format is that you're playing in? Does it make a big difference if you're in a 10-team or a 15-teamer or a roto or a head-to-head?
Yeah. So the biggest thing, and I guess I'll start like on a general level, like I like to add guys, and this is obviously easier said than done, but ahead of when they're potentially going to be called up. It's nice to act on the noise like a week or so before and not have to, bust the bank on FAAB or even miss out if it's a daily moves league and you're not able to make an ad when Vidal Brujan called up. But okay, two weeks before, yeah, sure, I might have been burning a bench spot, but at least I know that there was some noise that he could be coming up anytime soon. But I'd rather burn that bench spot and get him, even though that's a situation where it didn't really work out because he didn't do too great and they eventually sent him down. But that's pretty much how I approach it as far as trying to get a guy in all leagues. As far as what I do for expectations in head-to-head or roto, it really is team dependent. And I know it's like a cop-out answer, but I have been in my home league, for example, like my offense, I just felt has been struggling all year. So like I stashed Bobby Witt and I'm stashing a guy that I think we might talk about later, Josh Lowe, like guys that I think could be potentially offensive impacts. But like recently I made some trades, my offense got better, and now I was hurting for pitching. Like I added Detmers like 2 or 3 weeks ago. I was on the Angels. So again, that hasn't worked out, but that's like how I approach it. It's okay, I'm going to stash guys that I think could help me categorically, and that's in head-to-head or roto leagues, right? That's going to help you. If you're bad in pitching in roto, you're bad in pitching in head-to-head too. So I kind of, that's like the approach that I take. I'm generally more aggressive with prospects. I drafted Kelenic like way too early in a lot of leagues. I think I downplayed how important it was to actually have real games, not just him tearing up the alternate site, despite how good the Mariners pitching prospects are. That's going to be a big miss for me so far this year. But I'm more aggressive. I don't like to miss these sort of guys because I've missed on Aquino and I've missed on guys that could come up and be impactful. And I think that there really are going to be guys, as we sit here on recording this on August 7th, like there's going to be a guy that's a league winner that comes up it could be this week, right? Like there's guys that are going to come up and have impact. So I tend to be more aggressive overall.
Yeah, and I don't.
And sorry, Adam. I'll just add on to that real quick. I think the aggression early in the year with prospects is great, but then you have to be patient, which is difficult.
Now
you can be aggressive, and
you could drop anybody at this point, pretty much. It doesn't matter. Like I dropped in a 14-team league. Like I dropped Dylan Carlson today because like for Loaisaga, like I needed a closer. Like I'm not holding on. He's been fine, but I'm not. There's nothing really much for me to wait there. Like. It's time to go, and you could be more aggressive. It's why this time of year is pretty fun too. You don't have to worry about, it's only April 15th. Like I can't drop anybody just yet that I'm so high on. Now you can do whatever you want pretty much.
Yep, exactly. And it can hurt you. Like I was really aggressive with 2 pitchers earlier this year, 2 pitching prospects. One was Alek Manoah, which has gone extremely well. The other one was Daniel Lynch. And I waited out. Now I benched him against the White Sox that start where he got torched, which was great because you should not start a lefty against the White Sox at that point in the season. It was a bad idea. But I waited out the other starts and he really struggled. And now he's been good. His last few starts have been good. I haven't picked him back up because his next 2 starts are against the Yankees and the Astros, and so I'm going to wait those out. But I picked him up early in the year. I felt like I can't cut him after one start. Like I got to give him a shot. So it didn't work there, but it worked really well with Alek Manoah. So that's where it's a gamble. Whereas towards the end of the year, like I said, you pick up Reed Detmers, he struggles, you just drop him. It's fine.
Yeah, and I don't think that saying it's team dependent is cop out in this situation, just because there's so many different strategies you can be using, especially in a head-to-head league. It's a lot easier to tank certain categories and still win your matchups in your leagues and whatnot. There's a juggling act. We talk about all these stashes or these possible stashes, but Kevin talks about this with stashing closers, as we were talking earlier in the season. You can only stash so many because you do have to have able bodies in your lineup. You can't just stash prospects and expect to win. So you do have to pick your battles. You have to pick your choices, and hopefully you pick, and the guys you pick come up, and then maybe you can backfill that with a new stash. But you can only stash so many, and then you find yourself, this guy's been talked about a lot. Let's stash him. Let's drop the other guy, and you just like, what's the point of stashing, like rotating your stashes unless you get word that somebody's out for the year, like a Tyler Freeman who's out for Cleveland's AAA team for the rest of the season. He's obviously not going to get a September call up. Then you hear that, then fine, move on. All right, that's awesome. That was really great. I think this is good timing to have this kind of a conversation in the season, and we'll get into detail. We'll go into some player details a little bit later in the pod, especially when we get into our wild card section. But for now, let's get into some recommendations for this week's FAAB. As always, we will go category by category. About this is the time of year, and it has been for quite some time now, where you really need to be focusing on the categories you can make a dent into. Whether it's jumping up in the saves category or adding a couple extra stolen bases, depending on your league, it'll depend, and where you're at in those standings, it'll depend on what you're looking for. So let's start off with power. If you're looking for a couple extra home runs, a couple extra RBIs, or just a power bat that could fill in for an injury, who are we looking at? Steve, I'm going to start with you. Who do you have your eye on in the power category this Sunday night?
He's probably been a popular waiver wire target over the last few weeks. He's been pretty hot over the last month, and that's Adam Engel on the White Sox. I think now's like a good time to add him, just because the White Sox outfield's getting crowded. He might be getting dropped with Robert coming back and Eloy back, but he's been so good that they got to find a way to get him in the outfield. Over the last 3 games, he got 3 home runs, 4 stolen bases, and 845 OPS. He's been really good when he's on the field, and he might not be playing even 5 games a week. They're going to get him in there in good matchups versus righties, and I think he can provide some decent pop. I think he's 1% owned in Yahoo and 17% in TGFBI. So despite that hot run, he's been disregarded by a lot of teams in deeper leagues. So I think now is a decent time to pop to add Engel, because a lot of guys think that the playing time might get tight, which it will, but I think he could still provide value with how good he's been.
Yeah, I think Engel's a good call out definitely based on what he's done. Hopefully he gets the extra playing time moving forward. I would venture to guess that Engel would make a really good, like, if you have 2 or 3 other options and you put Engel in that.
He's a perfect platoon fantasy bat.
Sure. And if you have a waterfall, if you have 3 or 4 options out there in the free agent market in your league, put Engel in, bring all your bids down. Yeah. You don't have to spend a bunch of money on one guy when you can put Engel in there and be happy that you ended up with him. Andy, you have an eye on anybody in the power category coming up for FAAB?
Yeah, so it's the same division, the AL Central, but very different in virtually every other way. I picked Miguel Cabrera. So Miggy is obviously very, very close to his 500th home run. Do I think that means he's going to explode and hit a bunch of home runs this week? I don't know, not necessarily, but I think it's on his mind. I also think that he's been hitting the ball really well lately. He's hit 375 in his last 2 weeks with 4 home runs. It's a little mini power surge from one of the best power hitters of all time. By no means is he back to his old self or even particularly close to it. He's still not hitting the ball in the air enough. He's only striking out 24% of the time, which is good in this era, but is the worst of his career. So he's past his prime by a considerable amount. He's on the downhill of his career. That's not a secret in any way. But Detroit gets Baltimore at Baltimore for a few days this upcoming week. They get Cleveland, whose rotation is not in a very good spot right now. So it's a week where he's probably trying to hit that 500th home run at home. So maybe that's a factor there, but at Baltimore for 3 days for a guy who's hit 4 home runs in the last 2 weeks and is hitting well over 300 for an offense that's turned things around a little bit lately. I don't think it's the worst bet in the world. I certainly wouldn't put a huge amount of money on him. He's 10% owned in Yahoo, 49% in TGFBI. A lot of TGFBI probably doesn't have a chance to get him. I know he's not around in mine, but if you're in a format like that and you can just throw a couple bucks at him to see if maybe you can get a few home runs out of him this week, I don't think that's the worst bet in the world.
No, absolutely not, especially on a team that's, scoring as much as Detroit has been scoring at least since the All-Star break, if not prior to that. So definitely, and he's playing every day. He's still in the middle of that lineup. He'll probably be playing alongside Shoop for the next 3 years. Then now that Shoop got his extension to stay with the Tigers, but it'll be interesting to see how he reacts to getting the 500. And I'll be both equally not surprised and surprised if he's just like, I hit 500. All right, cool. I'm done. I'm good. Call it right now. All right, we'll move into the opposite category. We'll move into the speed category here. And Andy, I'm going to stick with you. Who are you looking at maybe that can rack up a couple extra stolen bases, if at least, one, if not 2, and could rack up a couple runs maybe at the top of a lineup or just based on the opportunity that they see?
Yeah, so when I was doing research for this, I was looking at the last few weeks and a variety of my leagues. I'm in a couple Yahoo leagues, obviously TGFBI, and I realized that I roster Oscar Mercado in all of my deep leagues, which is I was a little surprised by. I remember I picked him up in a few leagues when he got hot a few weeks ago. He's slowed down a little bit since then, but now he's in a spot where he seems to be playing pretty regularly in Cleveland. Cleveland's outfield is not in a very good spot, so he doesn't have to perform exceptionally well to continue to play regularly. He's got 3 steals in his last 30 games. We know that he's very fast. This isn't like a flash in the pan thing. He swiped 15 bags back in 2019, and that was in just 115 games, and he was able to steal 15 bases. So he's got a ton of speed. Cleveland lets him run. I don't think there's not a lot else in this profile that excites me. The 15 home runs that he hit in 2019 doesn't seem like it's coming back. I think that was a bit of a power aberration more than anything else, but he should score some runs. He'll steal some bases. He probably won't kill you too much, at least in OBP leagues, because he's got a pretty good walk rate. Again, it's not the most appealing option on the planet, but he's 1% owned in Yahoo leagues. And so he's going to be out there in a lot of different leagues. If you're in deeper formats and you just need somebody who might swipe a base or two, this seems like a good option.
And Cleveland is definitely a team that has liked to run this year. They are 10th in the league in total stolen bases, but they have the best success rate of any team in the league at 84%. So if you can run, you probably are running if you are in Cleveland. That's a good call out there. Steve, you got eyes on any speedsters out there in your leagues for FAAB this weekend?
No, the guy that I was eyeing up is probably rostered in most leagues, and that's Miles Straw. I know he's been another guy that's been running a lot, but if he is out there in any shallower leagues, it's worth picking up. And he actually hits a lot better versus righties. So I know he's not like a great power hitter or anything like that, and he's providing value despite a 650 OPS pretty much, but he does hit a good amount better versus righties. If he does have a matchup there, he's a good guy to slide in daily leagues, in shower leagues for speed.
Yeah, 98% rostered across online championships. That's 12-teamers in the NFBC. So not available in those deeper leagues. That's still 12-teamer, but obviously NFBC, that's fielders, 5 outfielders plus utility. Yeah. He does have shortstop eligibility on a couple of platforms as well, including Anu and Yahoo.
I think he's 68% in Fantrax, where I think he does have shortstop. So
a lot of those platforms carried over players' eligibilities from 2019, which was awesome in some respects. I know I was able to grab the outfielder Jordan Alvarez in a couple of my Yahoo leagues, so that was nice. All right, the only guy I'm gonna just reach out. I'm a little late to the party on this one. Is Rafael Ortega of the Cubs. He's leading off for the Cubs every day, and he was actually starting to lead off prior to the deadline and getting everyday playing time. But he's still available in over a quarter of the TGFBI leagues out there and half of the online championships. Like I said, he's leading off in Chicago. He's scoring a ton of runs, and the Cubs are still playing games. They're still a major league team, regardless of what you might think based on how many players they jettisoned at the deadline. And as long as he's at the top of the lineup, he's still a leadoff hitter, and there's very few leadoff hitters that are not going to be valuable in some way, and he's scoring a lot of runs. So he might steal a couple bags from here out until the end of the season. I wouldn't bank on that, but just the fact that he is the leadoff hitter in Chicago, he's going to continue to score runs as long as he stays healthy and they keep him at the top of that lineup. He stole 5 bags in his limited time this year, but he's also gotten caught 5 times as well. So not something I'm banking on, but if the Cubs want to just let him go to see if he can get better at it, then that's money in the bank. I brought up Ortega not only for the speed. Obviously, he had that 3 home run game the day before FAAB last weekend, which brought up his price in a couple of places, but he's still available. But I bring him up also because of the opportunity he brings to the table, being the new leadoff hitter. And so I want to talk to you guys about some other players that you have your eye on for FAAB that maybe doesn't fit specifically in a speed or power category, but they have found more playing time recently, or you think they're going to get more playing time due to these trades or due to just other things happening. Maybe they have good matchups. They're not, but maybe they're playing in cores. Colorado is away all week. And so on that note, before I ask your guys' opinions on some of those players that fit that category, I'm just going to break down some scheduling notes for everybody if they're taking notes at home, things to keep an eye out for when they're tiebreakers, when they're looking at a couple different players to put their bids on. There are only a few teams that have a 7-game slate this coming week. The majority of teams have 6 games, but Toronto, Cleveland, the Angels, the Cubs, Cincinnati, Milwaukee, and San Diego all have 7 games. That's with Toronto, and the Angels have a doubleheader on Tuesday. So they're both off on Monday, still get the 7 games throughout the week. Also, of note, I believe it's the White Sox have a rare Friday game off next week as well. So if you're looking at your lineups, especially in NFBC where you switch out your hitters on Fridays, you're going to lose a couple at bats there unless you have backups on your bench that you can toss in there. Only one team only has a 5-game slate, and that is the Houston Astros. Everybody else has 6. Colorado, as I mentioned, is away all week. They play at Houston and 4 games at San Francisco, so that makes a difference. And throughout the season, I feel like there's been a lot more this as far as NL teams and AL teams playing in opposite league stadiums. There's only 2 teams going into the opposite league, and that's Colorado, as I mentioned, have 2 at Houston, and St. Louis has 3 at Kansas City, so they're going to get the extra DH in their lineups for those games, so keep an eye on that. There are no AL teams heading to the NL, so all the other DH situations are going to be intact for the week. So after all that, Steve, I'll go with you. Are there any guys that kind of fit this category of having a good opportunity ahead of themselves for this coming week?
Yeah, I'll group the first 2 guys I want to talk about here together, and that's Carter Kieboom and Luis Garcia, with Trey Turner and Josh Harrison being shipped out of Washington. They're going to be playing a lot, and they've looked pretty good in the last few days doing so. Carter Kieboom has 2 home runs, 7 to strikeouts and 10 walks in 14 games. And Luis Garcia has 3 home runs since July 30th. They've been pretty good, and they're going to get playing time. I think Mike Rizzo has said these guys are going to play now that Turner and the crew are gone. So there's playing time. They're going to be in the lineup every day, and they're going to prove what they got. I know Kieboom had a lot of fanfare when he first came up and has struggled in a few more stints. It looks like he might have something finally figured out. He's never really had a stretch like this in his limited sample when he's been up in the majors. It's definitely something I'm intrigued by and excited for. He's definitely one of those guys that could be like the Aquino that we've talked about before. Like, he could go on a hot stretch here out of nowhere. He's probably my favorite candidate for that, who's up already so far. And Luis Garcia has shown some power this year that he really hasn't in the past. And despite that, he's been a pretty good prospect. I'm sure Andy could go into more detail on how he feels about Garcia prospect wise, but he's always been a decent prospect, at least in my eyes. And now they added some power and hit for that in AAA. I'm even more intrigued. So if he's going to get pretty much everyday playing time, which I don't see why there's not, I'm definitely interested in both of those guys. They're both pretty widely available. Kieboom's at 10% in Yahoo, 15% TGFBI. Luis Garcia's 1% rostered in Yahoo, 29% TGFBI. They should be out there this weekend for sure.
All right, good call outs there. Andy, you got your eye on any opportunity guys coming up?
Yeah, it's funny that this is the second, one of the most recent categories where I picked an old guy, even though I know that I'm the prospects or dynasty guy. But I want to talk about Aledmys Diaz, another guy that I found myself rostering in multiple leagues unexpectedly. Obviously, he missed a large chunk of the season with an injury, which I think is part of the reason he wasn't getting talked about a ton. But right now, he's playing at third base every day for Houston while Alex Bregman is out. Gurriel obviously is out as well, so there's some chance I think he's going to stick in the lineup for a while. Even when they're fully healthy, he strikes me as a guy who's going to play a fair amount. And he's having a really good season. He's hitting 277. He's already got 6 home runs on the year. And again, 6 home runs with him missing huge chunks of the season. I don't remember exactly how many games he missed, but he was out for quite a while. Multi-position eligibility, I think in Yahoo or in Fantrax, I think he's eligible at second, third, short. He might be there in TGFBI as well. So a guy who's going to play every day, at least in the short term. Realistically, he's going to play 4 times a week, even if Houston's completely fully healthy. Especially, they're going to start resting guys. I think they'll ease Bregman back in. I'm not actually sure the health situation with Bregman, but I see a lot of opportunities for him to continue to play. And so he's a guy who's quietly done really good stuff this year when he's played, and I think could continue to do that for the rest of the year.
Yeah, 4 positions eligible in Yahoo, first, second, third, and outfield for Diaz. So makes a nice little bench bat on most rosters in that format, if nothing else. All right, I got a couple Seattle guys I just want to touch on. These are going to be closer to your 12-teamers availability. Yeah, aforementioned Abraham Toro, available in 32% of online championships. Of course, that's on NFBC. Those are 12-teamers. Since joining the Mariner, he is slashing 432, 488, 757 through just 41 plate appearances. Give it that. But he's collected a hit in all but 1 game so far. He's had 5 multi-hit performances. He's playing mostly second base, so he'll be gaining that second base eligibility shortly in NFBC formats. He may already have it in some other formats like Yahoo that just give away position eligibility like candy. Makes him extra flexible in those corner infield and middle infield slots as well, especially if he just keeps on hitting. They obviously traded for the guy. They traded the clubhouse favorite, Kendall Granvin, for him. So it looks like they're going to continue to give him extra run, definitely more run than Houston was giving him. And I think he is somebody that can make a difference down the stretch in those not so deep leagues, 12-teamers, possibly even 10-teamers if he just keeps on hitting the way he's been hitting. And then also Luis Torrens, who has not been touring it up. I got to throw that in there lately. But the fact that he is catcher eligible and probably still hitting better than Isaiah Fluffel, the other catcher eligible that everybody likes to talk about, who doesn't play catcher. But he's available in 29% of online championships. He is DHing every day for Seattle. He hasn't shown a ton lately, like I said, but he faces off against Texas and Toronto next week. These 2 teams, they live in the top 10 for home runs allowed across the league. So he could find himself jumping back into the power surge that he was showing a little bit earlier in the season. So 2 names just to keep an eye on now, especially Torrens if you are desperate in a 2-catcher league and you need to fill in that second catcher spot due to either injuries or just needing a change of scenery. All right. So we'll move on to our pitching categories now, and we'll touch on our starters, typically our starters. But if you guys want to talk about any of you guys that are going to vulture a win, that's fine as well. So we are talking about wins and Ks, our counting stats. Steve, I will start with you and tell me if what pitchers you're looking at for this coming week. And we'll get to our future two-start pitcher list in a little bit. But for this coming week, who do you like to garner an extra win and a bunch of Ks for your fantasy teams?
Guys that I'm looking at, and this, I had this under the ERA whip, but I think it's more reasonable for next week. It could slide into this category too. It's another pair of teammates. That's Chris Rodriguez and Reed Detmers. Detmers is pitching Sunday versus the Dodgers. I don't know. I'll have to look up in a second who he's facing later on this week, but Chris Rodriguez, they just announced that he's coming back for one of the doubleheader games on Tuesday versus Toronto. I know that's not the greatest matchup, but Rodriguez has looked really good in his one start and pretty good out of the bullpen too. He's got really good stuff. So I'm really interested in him, not only in this week, but I think for a long term too. These two guys in Anaheim are guys that I'm really trying to target and roster pretty much everywhere, despite what seems like a tougher matchup on the surface. Blue Jays, at least Vlad has went from being Barry Bonds to now being like just a normal MVP candidate recently. So it's not, I think he's like, he had a 220 WRC plus the first, 2 or 3 months in the season. And now it's just like only 180. So he's only like Mike Trout now compared to peak Barry Bonds, which it's a decent time to face the Jays, despite the fact that Springer's heating up a little bit there. I still like the upside on Rodriguez, despite that tough matchup on Tuesday.
Yeah, Detmers does have the Dodgers on Sunday. They said he looks like he's lined up to face off against Houston next week.
So that's maybe those aren't the greatest for wins. I guess I could still slide them back into ratios. I'll pass to Andy and you here and come back with a better win. I'll regroup those to ratios. I take a pass on a win for those.
Looking even further though, he'll probably face off against Cleveland after that. So
there you
there's
go.
something
There
to
you
look
go.
forward to.
There you go.
Andy, any starters do you think that can rack up a win and or a few Ks this coming week?
Yeah, one guy that I had marked down is Drew Smiley's got Cincinnati on Tuesday and Washington at Washington on Sunday, according to Fantrax's pitching schedule at least. He hasn't been a huge strikeout guy this year. He's got 85 in 96 innings, so not exactly the ratios that you'd want from him from a strikeout perspective, but he's facing Cincinnati and Washington, and I think that there's a pretty good chance he could rack up more strikeouts than usual, and I would be pretty surprised if he doesn't find at least one win out of those two teams. Obviously, two teams that are Cincinnati's been okay. I don't think they're a bad team, but Atlanta's better, and certainly Washington at this point is not a team that's probably going to give them too much trouble. So looks like it could be a pair of wins and a fair amount of strikeouts, but at least should be one win and a reasonable amount of strikeouts. At least reasonable in terms of you're getting 2 starts, so it's going to be a fair amount regardless.
Right. And you know what? Sometimes that's all you need.
Right.
All right. Let's look ahead a little bit further, and let's look at the week of August 16th for our possible or probable 2-start pitcher matchups. So I got a list in front of you guys with current pitchers that currently line up to get 2 starts that week. So in case you want to get ahead of yourself and pick these guys up this week, you usually get a nice little discount when you're a week ahead, especially when it comes to these 2-start pitchers and their streaming options, especially if they don't have that great of a matchup this coming week. So Andy, I'll stick with you. Give me at least one, if not 2 of these guys that kind of interest you, that pique your interest for the 2-start matchup. And then throw me one guy on the list that you think will be popular that you'd probably be fading.
Yeah, I absolutely love my guy Skubal against Baltimore, even at Baltimore. That's not great, but I like him there. And then you got LA and Toronto after that. Or excuse me, so Skubal's, that's next week, and then he's got LA and Toronto after that. I was going to say I'm a little worried about him, though. I love the guy, but I might be fading him then. I'm not sure how many innings they're going to let him go. Detroit's been really specific about trying to limit guys in their innings. LA and Toronto is not the best. It's not the worst. So I think a lot of people will be like super into that, but I'd be a little bit hesitant there. And then in terms of guys that I like Cal Quantrill. He's been making some really nice adjustments. He's been looking really good at Minnesota versus LA coming up in the next week or the following week. Not too bad. Again, LA's hit and miss. I don't know how healthy they're going to be at that point, but I still think I like him against that matchup. And then Minnesota has not been hitting the ball particularly well this year. So that's the guy that I like. Skubal is a guy that I would be a little bit hesitant about with those matchups.
Yeah, big Quantrill against Oakland, who obviously is down at least one outfielder, and then facing off against the Angels, as you mentioned, obviously down an outfielder. You might have heard of him.
Yeah.
We'll let everybody guess who that might be. Steve, same question. Who do you like? Who don't you like?
The first guy that jumps off the page here for me is Logan Webb. I think he should be rostered way higher than his 46% in Yahoo leagues. I think he should be pretty much everywhere at this point. I think since like June 1, he's been a pretty awesome pitcher. I know he's had some injuries in there, but he looked really good. I think he struck out 10 guys on Friday, and then he's got the Mets and then at Oakland. The Mets offense has just been absolutely brutal for the last week and a half or so, and I would be basically trying to match up with any starter versus the Mets right now. And then his second matchup that week is at Oakland, and that's another place that you love to throw pretty much any starters, and a guy that's been as good as Webb, I'd be all over that. Another guy that jumps off the page to me is David Price because of those matchups. It's Pittsburgh and the Mets. So I'm just picking on the Mets offense here. Price probably should be more readily available in a lot of leagues. I really like those matchups there. And a guy that I would be fading despite juicy matchups is Jake Odorizzi. He's got at Kansas City and at Seattle. I think his mechanics are just like off. They've talked about that just being an issue with him, and he really hasn't looked right. He's been walking a lot of guys, and just it just really has been a lot more downs than up for him this year. He hasn't really looked like what he was in Minnesota, at least in 2019. I'm fading him despite those juicy matchups at Kansas City and versus Seattle. They've been a sneaky offense. I know they're a lot better on the road than they are at home, but with Toro there, they've been a lot better overall. That might be a guy that I'm going to fade, even though it looks like it's a good matchups on paper.
Yeah, I'm going to keep an eye on Vladimir Gutierrez, who has some really good matchups coming up next week. And to steal something I heard from you guys over on Wins Over Fantasy, Steve, he just has really good matchups the rest of the way. Yeah.
The Reds have a really good team to just target for starting pitchers. I'm all over that, and he looked really good. I know it was the Mets, but he looked really good. I think it was on Thursday of this week, and a guy that could provide some sneaky value down the stretch.
Yeah, so I might grab him this week, might sit him against as he plays Atlanta, but then to have the Cubs and Miami. Granted, it'll be in Cincinnati, but still, those still nice teams to go against. The guys, as a general rule that I'm fading, that maybe I shouldn't be, but basically anybody that's facing off in Baltimore, I really don't want my streaming pitchers going into Baltimore in August, especially as the summer continues to go on. And so Kyle Muller does get at Miami, but then he goes at Baltimore the following week, the following matchup. Same thing with Touki Toussaint. So those Atlanta two start pitchers, they might be guys I'm just like not prioritizing. Let's put that. I may not be fading them completely if I'm desperate, but they're not going to be at the top of my list for sure. All right, we will move on to the aforementioned ratio category, guys that can chip away at your ERA and WHIP, as we talked about with Todd Zola, and we've mentioned it a couple other times on the pod. These ratio categories are the categories that not only can you make headway in, but other teams can start breaking down and catch back up to you going down the standings. So definitely areas in which you need to focus on. Don't just count up all those counting stats. Steve, I'll start with you if you want to double down on some of the guys you talked about, or if you want to add some new guys in here. What are some guys that you're looking at that might be able to help you chip away at those really close ERA WHIP categories?
Yeah, I definitely would double down on Rodriguez and Detmer. I think they're just good pitchers and talented guys all around. But another guy that I've been rocking with, and you just mentioned, is Kyle Muller. I know he's got Cincinnati this week, but I think his slider is just a really good strikeout pitch. And I think despite any one of those matchups, he could have a game where he strikes out 6 or 7 batters in 5 innings and gives up 1 or 2 runs. I really like the way that he's been pitching, and like his blow up, his bad starts. I think he pitched yesterday, and it was like it's 4 innings, 3 runs with 4 Ks. That's like seemingly his floor. So I kind of like those sort of plays, like the high upside, low floor guys, especially this time of year, because of what you guys and Todd talked about. It's there could be such big swings, and to have guys that could limit the damage because they have strikeout pitches is huge. That's why I target Chris Rodriguez and Detmers. They're guys that could strike out a lot of guys. So Muller for me this week, despite being at home in Cincinnati, I know it would be a lot worse on the road in Cincinnati, but I like him this week. And despite being in Baltimore too, I like him for that 2-step next week as well.
Nice. All right, Andy, I'll move it on to you. What guys you might be looking at to chip away at those ratios?
Yeah, not a name that people necessarily are expecting to think about with regards to fantasy this year, but that would be Wade LeBlanc. LeBlanc's got Pittsburgh next week, and frankly, he hasn't been that bad. Now, he's not a strikeout guy. That's why we move him out of that category. He's definitely a ratio guy because he does not strike anybody out and hasn't for his entire career. But since the start of July, he hasn't given up 3 or more earned runs in a single outing. He's only gone 6 innings once in that time. He's gone 5 2/3 twice. So that's very frustrating if you're in quality start formats, obviously. But I don't think LeBlanc's a long-term play at all. But if we're looking specifically next week, we're looking that he's got Pittsburgh. And you just need your ratios to be a little bit more stable. I think it's worth a shot.
Nice. And the only name I really want to throw out there to keep an eye on is Mason Thompson in Washington. I know Kyle Finnegan has that closer job, and we'll get into saves in a second. So I'm not really expecting Thompson to walk into that saves role, as he just got moved over from San Diego to Washington. But since this whole season, he has only allowed 1 earned run in his limited run in the majors. He's had a really positive history in minors, and I think he could continue to see. He pitched the 8th inning instead of Ryan Harper before Finnegan blew up in that game. So he is starting to see some more high leverage situations. He's gotten, his last outing, he did walk away with a hold after, collecting 2 outs in the inning. So I could see him moving into more innings as they'd like to see what they have in him through the rest of the season. So Mason Thompson, keep an eye on him. If you need to chip away to ERA whip, he looks like a safe bet for that. And I think that he could get some extra run in the Washington bullpen and help you out in that category. In best case scenario, he walks himself into the highest of leverage situations and walks away with a save or 2.
I just want to jump in here real quick, Adam. 2 guys that I want to bring up too that are probably bigger key names that people heard of, but definitely interesting. One is Dylan Bundy. This is risky going on the record, actually recommending Dylan Bundy, but he looked really good in his last start. I know it was at the Rangers, no Joey Gallo in that lineup either, and it's pretty decimated, but he didn't give up any earned runs, 3 hits, 6 Ks, 2 walks, and 6 1/3. He's someone that, like, if I was desperate for pitching, I would add him this week, probably sit him down for that Toronto start, see how he does. And then his next start lined up is at Detroit. So again, Detroit's been better as an offense. I think they're like 7th in WRC plus since July 1, which is pretty crazy because the Tigers don't really jump off the page as a name, but their offense has been pretty good. Bundy's a guy that's done it before. If something clicks, like, he could be back to being a pretty good starter. So who knows? It's just something that I want to keep an eye on. And then another guy is Josiah Gray, who is going to be a hot item this week. He struck out 10 guys in 5 innings tonight with only 1 earned run. Just don't forget about him when doing your FAAB, because he's going to be a hot item this week with a performance like that on Saturday. I feel a lot better recommending him than Dylan Bundy, but 2 guys that you can't really forget about when making your bids this week.
Yeah, man, that 10 strikeout game today killed me, because in my home dynasty league, we have some weird minor league protection rules, and I have Josiah Gray in my minors. I don't have to call him up for another 3 years if I really want to play a manipulation game. I thought about calling him up today just because I needed the strikeouts, and I went with somebody else. I don't even know who I went with. It doesn't matter. And I'm like, was it really worth holding on to him for 3 years and with protection? No, probably not. I needed that a lot. Staying with Washington, just to go back to Mason Thompson, he did pitch the 6th today, but pitched a scoreless 1-hit inning, got 2 strikeouts. So still rolling with that 1 earned run on the year so far. All right, so we will move into the saves category again in this podcast, everybody's favorite category. And I will start off. I just want to throughout. Dylan Floro in Miami apparently has the job. Everybody, including myself, was going after Anthony Bender last week, and Bender might still end up with it long term. But I will echo something I think Greg Mish said, who covers the Marlins really well. And Mattingly really likes to stick with his guy. And if Floro is that guy right now, then Floro will continue to be that guy. So he had 2 back-to-back saves for the Marlins. And then, of course, Bender got the save the next day as Floro was going to be benched. I wouldn't think too much about that. I think Floro is going to get the next opportunity. Unfortunately, it'll be this weekend when they're in Colorado, and I don't think it's going to happen today, which I believe the Marlins are down by 6 or 7 runs at the moment, so that's probably not going to happen. So take a look at that, which is actually probably nice because it'll keep bidding down for those who are not paying that much attention to the closer market. Andy, I'll go to you. Is there a situation out there that you are, I will use the term very loosely, interested in when it comes to closer speculation this time of year?
Yeah, I'm looking at Seattle. I'm trying to figure out what they're going to do. Obviously, they traded Kendall Graveman at the trade deadline in the Abraham Toro deal. Since then, they went out and acquired Diego Castillo from the Rays. Castillo's been the guy. He got a save earlier last week, but he blew a save yesterday or Friday. And granted, the whole bullpen didn't pitch particularly well that day, but I'm keeping a close eye because I think Paul Sewald could end up back in that role. I don't know. He's probably not the most available guy in a lot of those leagues right now because people are still holding him. But if he got dropped or if he never got picked up and he's available, Sewald's a guy I would take a look at. If nothing else, because Castillo threw a decent amount of pitches on Friday, maybe he could sneak something. Or if Castillo, I didn't check to see if he threw tonight, but if he threw tonight, that definitely would be something to keep an eye on as well. And then even Drew Steckenrider in that bullpen, he's been extremely good. I think Sewald's next in line, but I have a close eye on Steckenrider as well as a guy I think could end up sneaking some saves potentially, or at least be really good for your ratios.
I was hoping you were going to say Sewald when you started talking about the Mariners bullpen. He's great. And
course.
Also, I think that blown save for Castillo was in the 8th. So I don't know if they had planned on him going 2 innings or if they went to if they were planning to go to Steckenrider even in the 9th. But that's just another interesting note, the fact that did happen in the 8th when he walked those guys and blew that save. So it's interesting. I'm hoping that Sewald could get some save opportunities there just because it's a great story and he's been absolutely awesome.
Yeah, similar thing happened to Bednar in Pittsburgh last week as well, where he came in the 8th and then ended up with a blown save. And you wonder, maybe he would have gotten a 2-inning save. And then instead, Chris Patton came in and obviously got the save on that day. Who are you looking at, Steve, when it comes to possible closer opportunities?
In the notes, I next to Tampa Bay, I just wrote UGG just because it's Tampa.
Yes,
Matt Whistler, I think, got the last save. I could be mistaken, but he's been pretty good. And I tend to just stay away from the Tampa bullpen. Even when Castillo was there, like they still like randomly would play games where Castillo like pitched like high leverage situations in the 6th, and it's like, where are your saves? What is going on? But at least until they're battling with some injuries, I think Whistler could get some opportunities there. And even when everyone's back, like the fact that he's got a save, like there's going to be a random day that he gets a save like in the next week or two, even when these guys get healthy. But for a guy that I think could be locked into a role, even though he's on a bad team, that's Spencer Patton in Texas. He got the last save for the Rangers. He's been pretty good this year. I know a lot of guys like Joely Rodriguez, but he ended up being traded to the Yankees in the Gallo deal. So that kind of clears the pathway there for him. Even though there might not be a lot of opportunities, I think he's deserved it and probably should get the next save opportunity in Texas.
All right, great. So we're done with that. We're done with talking about closers or possible closers. We'll put that under the rug and we'll get to the category I think we're all here for, especially with Andy here with us, is our wild card. And now this doesn't have to be prospects. It could be just speculative ads for any reason. Prospects obviously are included in that, but it could be just a flyer that's on a team that you think might find his way into more playing time for whatever reason, a current bench stash, an IL stash, what have you. Before I get into who you guys are looking at, I want to ask, I'll direct it at Andy specifically, but Steve, obviously, let me hear your takes on it. One guy who I literally just added to the rundown 3 seconds ago is Jose Barrero. It used to be Jose Garcia in Cincinnati, probably their top prospect. He's he got a little cup of coffee last year, and he's killing it right now in this season in AAA to the tune of, I believe, he's had 8 home runs. He's batting 306 with a K rate under 25%, which is nice because he's had his moments of much higher percentages. And he didn't really light the world on fire last year when he came up, and came up probably a little earlier than people thought he might. But I'm curious to see if you think there's a possibility that he gets another call up this year based on the fact that he already made an appearance in the majors. Obviously not that great of one where he had a 38% K rate in 24 games. But with Mike Moustakas back in the lineup for the Reds, is there room for him to even come up, especially with the Reds thinking they might possibly have a chance at a wild card spot?
Yeah, I think Garcia or Barrero, when he was Garcia in 2020, was really too early. It was too early. He wasn't ready. And he looked flat out very bad at that time. And it was startling because he was this highly rated prospect. And so there's a part of me that wonders if Cincinnati is going to feel like that it's still too early. Like it's only been a year, but he's looked like a different hitter in the minor leagues with Cincinnati. He put up really good numbers in AA, and he's been better in AAA in basically the same amount of time. It's been a really nice season from him. Jonathan Indy has had a ton of success, so it's not like he's their most recent prospect call-up that didn't go very well, so maybe there's a little bit more confidence there. But I think it's worth giving him a shot if you can find him some at-bats. But again, with Cincinnati in the middle of things right now, and with Moose back, like if they're not going to get him at bats, it's not worth doing. And so it puts him in a tough spot, because I think he's proven that he's a lot closer to being ready than he looked like last year, but it still might not be the right call to get him up this year.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to make sure I called out the fact that he did change his name in case anybody wasn't aware, and all of a sudden they saw him come up and they're like, I don't know who this is. I mean, it's not a big deal. Yeah. But yeah, he obviously has been doing really well for himself. I ran into that situation in another league of mine with Trent Grisham, who obviously changed he used to go by Trent Clark. And I'm like, oh, nobody has him on their roster. I can just pick him up. Turns out I got yelled at by a team because they already rostered him under his actual name.
That's funny.
Andy, I'll let you start us off. You know what? No, we'll save Andy for later. And Steve, we'll start with you. What wild cards are you looking at as a possible stash, or any other possible reason?
So 2 guys that I'm stashing, I'm putting my money where my mouth is. These are the 2 guys I'm stashing in my 14-team home league team. It's Bobby Witt Jr. and Josh Lowe. I know that Kiermaier actually got hurt today. I don't know how serious it was. He left the game with a knee injury. I think that's still developing news, so we'll see. Who knows? That could be like Brujan, or Lowe's actually on the 40-man. So he's been great. He's got power and speed. I think he's got double-digit steals and close to 20 home runs with close to 900 OPS at AAA this year. He's basically done everything that he could do at the AAA to prove the Rays that he could be called up. But I know that doesn't necessarily mean that he'll get a call up because it's the Rays. Bobby Witt, I know he struggled a bit to start, but then really lit the world on fire in AA, and he really hasn't missed a beat in AAA. I think he's got 10 home runs, hitting above 290. Close to, I think he's at 8 steals too in just a few weeks in AAA, something like that. So he's been absolutely awesome. I think we talked about this on the show last time I was on, but steals in the minor leagues could be misleading just because the catchers aren't as good, and guys run and can just steal bases with ease that might not translate to the majors. But these are both guys that have tantalizing power and speed combos as far as prospects go. So these are guys that, what I was talking about earlier, like I'm adding them now, despite the fact that there's no news on them coming up, even where I don't have a minors or an NA slot, just because I'd rather burn my one usable stash spot on these guys because they're just the highest upside guys that there really are. I'm all over them and adding them where I could, basically in anticipation, then use your FAAB to stream or do things like that. Because if you have the hammer, that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to blow it on one player. Like you could stream whoever you want in weekly leagues if you have the most FAAB dollars, right? So it could still come in handy to be prudent with your waiver wire dollars in other ways, despite just using it on one player. I think people forget that. It's all right, I saved that I could blow all my money on Bobby Witt when he comes up. It's all right, add him now, and then you could just do whatever you want and have the choice of any player that you could possibly be on the wire. Yeah. It's something to keep in mind, I think. As far as pitchers that are wild cards, one guy that that came to mind is TJ Antone. If he could have got dropped in leagues where there's no IL, he actually went on a rehab assignment today. He was a guy that even when he wasn't in the closer role was just providing value with how good he was. So I would scoop him up there. And then I guess a good segue to Andy, a guy that I think could be interesting to stash or add. And who knows, maybe he'll get some time up here if the Dodgers decide it. But that's Ryan Pepiot. I know he's been awesome in Double-A. He just got promoted to Triple-A recently, so it'd be probably a bit aggressive to promote him. But it's just someone that I'm keeping an eye on, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on not only Bobby Witt and Josh Lowe as far as when you think they could put up, but Pepiot as well.
Yeah, Pepiot's definitely on my list. I was looking at him just yesterday when I was writing the pitcher stash list, and I do think it'd be quick to turn him around to the big leagues this year, but I definitely have a close eye on him because he's having a really good season, and LA is not afraid to do something like that if they really need to. Yeah, Witt is the top of my list for hitter stash this week. Lowe's, I think 3 or 4 on the list. 2 guys that I've been paying close attention to all year long. Witt, I did what you talked about. I picked him up early. I think I picked him up last week in a waivers league just because I had an extra bench spot and I wasn't using it most weeks. And I was like, I might as well hold on to a guy who has a real chance to make an impact down the stretch. And same with Lowe. He's in Fantrax leagues. I know he still has third base eligibility, which is super nice. So in leagues where he has, that's an added bonus for you too, but he's an outfielder. He's a full on center fielder from here on out, but he's got a nice combo of power and speed. And I'm excited to see him when he finally gets up.
Yeah, Lowe has third base eligibility in Yahoo as well. It's the only eligibility he has in Yahoo, so he'll have to gain that outfield eligibility once he comes up. All right, Andy, what other players are you looking at specifically besides your top guys in Witt and what have you?
Yeah, so I'm looking at, I put down some stash candidates here too. And Steve's been talking about if you're going to stash a guy for potentially multiple weeks, you want it to be like a super high upside guy like Witt or like Lowe. These guys that I'm going to mention are guys that I really like and think could do some good stuff this year. If you're going to stash them ahead of time, you're going to want to lay virtually nothing down because otherwise it's not really worth it. But definitely pay attention to them when they do finally get the call. For hitters, that's Jose Miranda of the Twins and Jahmai Jones for the Orioles. Starting with Miranda, he's been like one of the best hitters in minor league baseball this year. He's been absolutely ridiculous. Fellow Pitcher List writer Nate Handy did an awesome article on him that came out earlier this past week. Details all of his home runs this season, how he attacks hitters or how he attacks it in counts, like he swings early, all of that stuff. It's a fantastic piece. I wrote him up in a much smaller way in the latest hitter stash article, linking to that article and just talking about his numbers. He's hitting 345 with 22 home runs between Double-A and Triple-A. He's been an absolute monster. Now for Minnesota, Josh Donaldson didn't go anywhere. He's still there. They still got Andrelton Simmons, Jorge Polanco up the middle. Luis Arias, Nick Gordon are all around. So they got a lot of depth at the spots that Miranda plays. He's second, third. So that's the only thing. But if they give him a chance, if he gets a chance because of injury or they just want to give him up, I'd be picking him up immediately. And if you get wind that he might be coming up soon from whatever reason and you want to pick him up a week early, I think he's got the bat this year at least to be worth it. And then Jahmai Jones, he was with the Angels for a long time. He actually made his debut with the Angels very briefly before he got flipped to Baltimore this offseason. I wrote about him before the season. I thought Baltimore was going to give him a look early this year. Like I thought he was going to get a chance within the first few weeks. But despite the fact that Baltimore's second basemen have been the worst in the league, they have the 62 WRC plus on the season. They've been really bad. They still haven't given Jones a call, and he's been super good at AAA. He was dealing with an injury, which slowed him down a little bit, but he's got a 12.5% walk rate. He's got 8 home runs and 9 steals, and that's only in 56 games. So a guy who's like on pace for a 2020 season if he'd been healthy. I think he's probably good enough to be Baltimore's second baseman today. I don't know why they're not giving him that chance, quite frankly. I'm hoping that he gets called up pretty soon. I don't expect him to be like an elite fantasy player by any stretch, but he's got enough power and speed to be meaningful in 12, 14 plus team leagues, especially with that second base outfield eligibility that I believe he has in most formats.
Yeah, that second base eligibility alone makes him very useful, if not for this year, definitely for next year. All right. And then I see you listed a couple pitchers on here as well.
Yes, I sure did.
Yeah, you did.
All right. Yeah, the first arm that I put here is Connor Siebold. And for Siebold, he's with Boston. He was part of that Nick Pivetta trade, which has worked really well for Boston so far, not so well for Philly. But Siebold, he missed most of the year with an injury, so he hasn't been on the radar for very long. His first 2 starts at AAA weren't very good, but his last start, which was just a few days ago, was very good. 6 innings, 1 walk, 1 hit, 10 strikeouts. He looked really good. I watched some film from that and he looked awesome. And so he's never been a super highly rated prospect, which we talked about of this is the time of year where some of those guys pop. And again, with Boston, it depends on Chris Sale's health. It depends on what they do with Tanner Hoke. Like they got some options here. They don't need to go to Seabold necessarily, but I could definitely see them trying it, giving him a few starts and just seeing what he's capable of doing. And I wouldn't be surprised if he turns some heads, and he looks pretty good. And then the last arm's Joe Ryan, the ace for the Team USA Olympic team this past weekend over in Tokyo. But he went to the Olympics teammates with Shane Baz, and then he came back on a different team as Shane Baz because he got traded to the Twins while he was in Tokyo, which was odd.
Olympian teammate now in Simeon Woods Richardson.
That's true. That's true. Who wasn't his teammate at the time because Woods Richardson was traded later. Yep. It was a whole Minnesota just seemed to be really in on their GM was watching
Olympics,
the Olympics apparently.
Get me those guys.
Yeah. But Joe Ryan's, he's having a great year at AAA. He's in such a crowded situation in Tampa with so many good arms that they have who are all ready to debut around the same time. And so he kind of got skipped over a little bit, but now he's in Minnesota. He's one of their best pitching prospects. He's a phenomenal whip guy. His whip is 0.79 on the season. He doesn't walk anybody. And he's not like super overpowering. His fastball's more deceptive than it is with a lot that doesn't have a lot of velocity. But I think he could be like a solid like ratio guy in the big leagues. And he's already 25. Like he could be that now. If Minnesota gives him a chance. And so if he gets called up, I'd definitely be interested in him if that's the kind of pitcher that you need for your team. Again, he's not like as soon as he gets called up, you throw a bunch of fab at him type guy, but he's a guy that I'd be definitely paying attention to and thinking can help down the stretch.
Nice. Well, keep an eye on all of these players that we're talking about throughout your bidding process. If not this week, then the following week, and just the Olympics are over. A guy like Ryan, he could be coming up as soon as he gets back into the States. And so I know they did lose to Japan earlier today. Walking away with the silver medal in the Olympics is no slouch.
Pretty good.
Yeah, it's not too bad.
What about J-Rod, Andy? You think there's a chance or no? So I know he was at the Olympics, so I think that was like, all right, we'll see what happens after. There wouldn't be a chance before that, but now that we're there, do you think that there's a chance maybe for when the rosters expand in September?
I think it's very slim. I don't think the Mariners are going to do it. They've tried to. Their president, when he was on camera saying a bunch of like mean stuff about the Mariners, he acknowledged that. He was like, "Yeah, Julio, he's not going to come up this year. He might not even come up next year," which is obviously BS. He will be up next year. There's no doubt about that. But Rodriguez, like I could see it. There are situations where they do if they really like if they're still in contention and they need him. That's probably the most likely scenario is if they're still in contention and Taylor Trammell or Shed Long or whomever is playing like a significant amount of time in the outfield, they're going to have to consider it at that point. It's been 20 years. Like you got to make a push to make the playoffs at the end. I think if they fall out of contention, I doubt it. I think a lot of people will clamor for it because they'll be like, now, okay, turn to the future. It's time. But I don't think that they'll do it. But if they're pushing for it, I would love the aggressiveness. I think it would be awesome. And they did it with Kyle Lewis. Granted, they weren't trying to win, and he wasn't as highly rated of a prospect. But they did give Kyle Lewis like 3 weeks in September. So maybe if the stars align, I could see it.
Yeah,
happening.
that'd be awesome if they were just like, whatever, 3 or 4 games out of the wild card and be like, all right, 3 weeks, let's do it. Let's try it. That'd be amazing. That'd be great. Yep. Just as a baseball fan, not even fantasy wise.
Sure.
You can always remember that you can manipulate the time. The Mariners can manipulate the time next year as well. Like they can call them up for 3 weeks this year and then just hold them down for 6 weeks instead of 3 weeks next year. And they'll still get the extra added time. So there are ways you can do it. So like Brujan's another perfect example. Like they can still get the extra year out of Brujan if he doesn't make his way back up this year. And then it's just held down a little bit longer at the beginning. I don't know. I don't necessarily think that it's going to happen with Brujan, but like you remember, it's not linear. Like you can miss time throughout the season. And so like Andrew Vaughn could still technically be manipulated if they, whatever reason, optioned him down. Again, don't expect that to happen, but just remember it doesn't have to happen at the beginning of the season. All right, I think that's gonna do it for this. Some really good players that we talked about today. Hopefully that does everybody a little bit of legwork ahead of their FAAB bids. And as you're going into your FAAB bidding process, you're always going to be considering looking at who you need to drop in order to bring on some of these guys. And the thing I want to leave everybody with is that we're far enough into the season with very little amount of time left. And this echoes a little bit of what Steve said earlier on. You can't be afraid to be dropping pretty much anybody at this stage of the game. So those who are rostering Cody Bellinger or those other superstar names that are providing literally nothing except for name value, don't be afraid to be that guy that ends up putting those players onto your waiver wire. Let them be somebody else's headache. And the fact that you held on to him for this long probably did you more harm than good. So keep that in mind, what these players actually did for your team throughout the season and what do you expect them to do moving forward. So you should always be considering what you're paying for when you're doing your bids. You're not paying for what they've already done. You're paying for what you think they're going to do moving forward. And same should be thought about with the players that are already on your roster. So if these are players that have proven pretty much nothing and they are not going to continue to do anything moving forward, don't be afraid to send them packing, especially if you are in a tight race. Just don't be afraid. We are past the point of being afraid and holding on to where you drafted a player. And so I will leave everybody with those parting words, and we'll see you guys next week. This is going to do it for this episode of On the Wire. If there's a player that we didn't talk about that you were thinking about bidding on and you want us to discuss it in the future episode, you can always contact us in various ways. You can email us over at onthewirepod@gmail.com. You can shoot us a DM over on Twitter at onthewirepod. And of course, you can join PL Plus over at pitcherlist.com, where you get access to the Pitcherlist Discord and the advice and banter of all the members and Pitcherlist staff, including all three of us who are just waiting to help you win your league. I want to thank, of course, our guest, Andy Patton, for joining us on this episode. Andy, could you remind all of our listeners where they can listen to you, no matter what you're talking about, and read your work, where they can read your work, and if you have anything big coming up that they should be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Andy Patton PNW. Obviously, I write at Pitcherlist. I write a weekly article on pitcher stashes and hitter stashes, like I mentioned earlier. Those come out on Saturday and Sunday. So by the time you're listening to this, they both should be out. You can go read those, looking at some names to potentially consider for your leagues. And then you can also find me, if you do want to hear those Gonzaga basketball takes that we mentioned earlier, you can listen to those at Scorzag Score. It's available wherever you find podcasts. And there's a Twitter account for that as well at Scorzag Score. I also talk about the Seattle Mariners for the Never Sunny in Seattle podcast with Michael Ahedo. So that's a really fun way to hear specific team stuff about the Mariners. And then I also am on the Farm podcast here at Pitcherlist as well.
That's awesome. And then, of course, I want to give special thanks to Steve for filling in Kevin's big shoes. I actually don't know which Kevin's shoe size is, so I'm just assuming that they're very large, LeBron style size shoes. Can you let everybody know where they can continue to listen to you and what you might have coming up?
Yeah, you could listen to me every Wednesday, Wins Above Fantasy. That's part of the Pitcherlist Podcast Network. You can follow us on Wins Above Pod. That's with my awesome co-host, Van Burnett. We actually had our first ever in-person meeting at my wedding 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Which was awesome. It was like a thing we threw out on the air and actually ended up working out, and he was able to come out. It was pretty hilarious, and that was great. But you can listen to us every Wednesday, just talking like general fantasy strategy, recapping hot players, everything to do with fantasy baseball. That's what we're hitting on. And then I also write for Pitcherlist. You can find my work there. We worked on like a hitter mechanic change tracker that will start to pick up once the offseason picks up, and keep track of guys that to keep an eye on. A big guy that was on that list was Cedric Mullins. I unfortunately dropped him for a stream of Matt Shoemaker in April, so should have probably listened to my own advice there on that mechanical hitting tracker.
We've all been there.
Yeah, I'm kicking myself for that one. I probably wouldn't be battling for a playoff spot in my home league. I'd probably be in one had I held on to him there. But despite my mistakes, you could always listen to my advice every Wednesday at Wins Above Pod on Twitter and wherever podcasts are found.
Yeah, basically, if you're listening to this podcast, you'll be able to find Steve's podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, that's going to do it for this week's On the Wire. Please make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen, and leaving a rating review is always appreciated. In addition to Steve and Andy, you can follow myself on the Twitter at 80grade. That's all spelled out. And of course, Kevin is at HastingKevin. And make sure to follow at Pitcherless Pods to get updates about every new episode of all the Pitcherless Podcast Network shows, including Wins Over Fantasy and On the Farm, and give them all a listen. We wish you the best of luck in all of your leagues and hope you win all of your bids by exactly $1. Thanks again to Steve and Andy for joining me. I am Adam Howe, and with that, we bid you goodbye.
McDonald's presents Burger Reviews by Hamburglar, the classic cheeseburger. Hamburglar? Rubble, rubble. He said, the patties are juicier than ever before. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Brabble. Available at most restaurants in this area.
When it comes to teaching kids and teens about money, practice makes perfect. That's where Greenlight comes in. With a debit card and money app of their own, kids learn to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest. Parents send instant money transfers, create custom chores, and automate allowance, while kids track their spending, set savings goals, and practice money skills they can use today and for life. Get 1 month free when you sign up at greenlight.com/podcast.